Good evening all, and welcome. As we go through life, there are always people who you'd rather not meet, who may, or may not, be on certain illicit substances to make their reactions somewhat different than they perhaps usually might be. I suppose we're about to find out, so get comfortable and let the darkness take control. A little background information about me. I have panic disorder. For those of you who don't know what it is, it's a mental illness that causes extreme anxiety, severe panic attacks, and a slew of problems. I've been suffering with this for over a year now, and while it's getting better, it is still very difficult to deal with. Please keep this in mind. My husband and I have been married a little over a year now. The time we were married, unfortunately, I was undergoing medical issues that no doctors could seem to explain. I was having panic attacks all the time, and they would be so severe, I would have to be taken to the ER, where they would have to literally sedate me to calm me down. I was also losing weight at an exponential and scary rate, becoming sicker and sicker as time went on. Not even a month after we were married, I lost my job and was homebound while my husband worked second shift, which was 4 p.m. to 3 a.m. He would arrive home at around 4 a.m., leaving me alone most of the time. My parents and younger brother live close by, perhaps a 10-minute drive at most. But at the moment, my mother, who is a schoolteacher, and father, who works in a factory, were unable to watch over me. They called me as frequently as they could, but that was all they could do. In May, I was told by doctors that I was literally at death's door, and unless something happened quickly, my family was going to lose me. I was given medication to help with the panic attacks and to get me to eat. They wanted to hospitalize me, but I refused. My parents decided that when they and my younger brother went to Florida the next month, they were taking me with them. Again, keep in mind, I am both anxious and extremely sick. Around this time, the real issue begins. Not with me, but with our neighbors. See, we've never actually met our neighbors personally. My husband lived in the trailer for a month on his own before we married, and he always said they were odd, but they didn't seem to be of any concern. However, once I came into the picture, that changed. The person who lived in the trailer before us was actually a cousin of mine, who rented from another cousin and his wife who lived states away. Nora was a huge druggie and a drug dealer, so people got used to getting their fixes and drugs at the trailer we now live in. Then a few months before we moved in, she got in trouble with the law and landed in jail for some time. I'm guessing our neighbors who, according to our landlords, were drug addicts and raging alcoholics as well, and they thought that perhaps she was back. I'm not quite sure. I suppose this is because from where I was so sick, and my husband slept when he could from both working odd hours and taking care of me, so they never actually saw us. They just knew that someone was there. They became active at night. During the day, they were predominantly quiet. Every once in a while, they would do something outside, but for the most part, nothing really happened. It was always after my husband left for work. My car was still there, which should have told them at least someone was still home. It started off innocently enough, driving up and down in front of the house, parking in the road directly in front of it, and waiting. They'd honk the horn, but I ignored them. Several times I called my parents, asking them what to do. They said for me to just ignore them, because maybe they thought Nora was back, and after some time they'd get the hint it was new people and leave me be. So I did just that, for a time. When they started driving up the driveway and stopping at the porch, that is the first time that I called the cops. All I was told was as long as they didn't encroach on my actual property, there was nothing they could do. They advised me to turn on the lights to my house, signaling I was home. I couldn't sleep, despite needing to. I had mono and panic disorders and depression, and I desperately needed to sleep. My husband had the weekends off, and you can guess it, there were never any issues then. It was insane and infuriating. Everyone believed me when I said I was having problems, but there was only so much I could do. My father-in-law brought over one of his shotguns, a 12 gauge, knowing that I was a good shot. He told me to use it if I needed to. Another background thing is that I shot trap for years, and when I was 18, I placed second in district. I chose not to go to state, but knowing I was good enough for second was a proud moment for me. My father-in-law made me promise I would use it if it came to it. So I did. One night, my husband was at work, and I guess my body finally shut off. I fell asleep for once, only to be awoken at 1 a.m. to the sound of our neighbor's truck tearing out from behind the trailer. I jumped up and looked outside to see them driving out of our driveway. They started speeding up in front of the house, and I called the cops again. I called my dad, my mum, and my dad came over because I was in full panic attack mode. My dad called my husband, who came immediately. There were tire marks in the grass behind the trailer, but they couldn't necessarily prove it was them, despite me describing their truck down to the dents. My dad told the cops this had been going on long enough, but again, there was not enough evidence nor proof. A week, just one more week until I could go with my family to Florida. I somehow managed to be a bridesmaid in my older brother's wedding, despite being so sick. I was doped up on medication to keep me calm, so that I wouldn't have another panic attack, and to be honest, I don't recall much about that day other than it poured with rain. My husband, naturally, was at work. I was sitting at home, our 2 cats soundly asleep, and I was playing my 3DS, with Markiplier on the TV for background. The time around midnight, my cats suddenly awoke and came unglued. They ran to the side door, then to the front door, growling and hissing, their hair on end. They'd never behaved that way before, so I started to get up to see what it was they were freaking out about. When I hear it, "How are we gonna do this?" I froze. I heard them. I heard their footsteps as they walked up and down the front porch. I wasn't sure how many there were, but I knew for a fact there were at least 3 men outside. My curtains were closed, and most of the lights were off, but the TV was on, and surely they could hear Markiplier's eccentric volume. They had gotten quieter. I heard their footsteps on the porch again. I grabbed my phone, shakily swiping it until I found my dad's number and calling him. I remember breathing hard, feeling a panic attack setting in. "Hello?" They're here," I remember sobbing. "They're on the porch, Daddy. They want to get in." "I'm on my way. Call the cops." I hung up with him, then heard them talking amongst themselves on how they wanted to break in and what they wanted. I ran into the bedroom, grabbed the 12 gauge, opened the chamber to see it fully loaded and called the cops. I left the lights off. I decided I was going to have them caught this time, and I wasn't going to run off. The dispatch answered. and I told them what was going on. As sick as I was, I managed to hold that shotgun to my shoulder, pointed at the door, remembering everything my dad taught me about shooting while I was a hunter and when I shot trap. But I was still scared out of my mind. Somehow I kept my panic attack down, but I was still breathing hard. "Calm your breath, son. You say they're outside." "Yes. I heard one say they heard me. Then the other one said it wouldn't be a problem." "Oh my God." "They're coming, sweetie, I promise." "I'm armed." "Excuse me?" "I'm armed." I said it, hoping that they'd hear me. "With what, sweetheart?" 12 gauge. They want to hurt me. I'm not gonna let them." "She's armed," I heard him tell the police, who were supposed to be on their way. I heard "armed" from one of the guys outside, then silence. "Ma'am?" "I can't." I heard the footsteps, leaving, then saw the lights to my dad's truck. "My dad's here." I lowered the shotgun and ran outside, my dad and younger brother running out of the truck. My dad had the Judge in hand, which is a pistol that shoots 12 gauge rounds and feels like a hand cannon. You'd swear you'd just broken your wrist. While my younger brother was holding a knife. "It's my dad and brother. They're armed too." "Okay, what of the men?" "I don't see 'em." "When the cops get there, disarm yourselves, okay?" I thanked the dispatchers for everything, and about this time the cops pulled up. I told my dad and younger brother to disarm, so they put the weapons in the truck while I took my gun inside and sat in the kitchen on top of our dinner table. My dad told me to get back in the house and for my younger brother to go with me. As soon as I stepped inside, the panic attack hit. My dad came inside for a moment and hugged me, telling me how brave I had been, especially for holding it as long as I did. Shaking, crying, gasping for breath, I listened as he went back outside. The cops found footprints and an area on the porch where the men had tried to break in at one point, but the men had scattered, leaving it difficult for the cops to trace exactly where they came from. My dad told them it was the neighbors, and my landlord actually called and told the cops it was more likely our neighbors as well, who had apparently been giving my cousin who lives up the road a difficult time too. The cops noticed some of the footprints went into the neighbor's yard, but they weren't home, of course. I remember my dad and younger brother standing outside, just as the cops pulled up, yelling as loudly as they could that they would drop them if they ever so much as saw them around me again. "Enough is enough," my dad yelled over and over. "She's sick. She needs rest. Leave her the hell alone or I'll drop you, I swear." And I noticed he was crying. My dad isn't the type of person to do that. My whole life, I've seen my dad cry maybe a handful of times. When he talked about his deceased father, when my grandma died, when the doctors told me I was on death's door, when my younger brother was born, with 10 years difference between us. My dad had been scared that he wouldn't get there in time, and maybe, just maybe, I would hesitate to protect myself. But I had made my mind up. I wasn't going to let them get away with it anymore. That night, my husband came home from work and hugged me so tightly, I thought my lungs would burst. My younger brother texted him what was going on, but reassured him I was okay. A week later, I went to Florida. Time went on, and I'm still getting better. As for my neighbors, I've never had problems with them again. I'm not sure if it was the cops actually going to their house, or if it was my dad and younger brother threatening them. Or maybe it was me, them hearing me say that I was armed. I don't know, and I don't care. They're still there, but I know they won't do anything, ever, again. This happened to me over a year ago. at the end of March 2017, and I still can't be alone in my own home. 3 years earlier, I had moved into a house that my grandparents left me before they passed away. I'd spent some time renovating and was happy enough with it to move in. My grandparents had rented out the top floor to students and had made it into a SMA apartment. When I moved in, I decided to let my cousin, who had some small personal problems, to move upstairs, while my fiancé and I used the 2 remaining floors for ourselves. We lived in a small town, and like in any small town, everyone basically knows everyone. And like most men in our town, my fiancé is a fisherman and goes away for long periods of time during the winter, sometimes from January to May. In our town, there are 2 brothers that are, well, I guess you can call them weird. Some may say original. Though we all know they had struggles in the past, that's probably the reason to their behavior. But my path never crossed theirs, and I never spoke to them, mostly due to an age difference. On this particular night, I was home alone. My fiancé was up north fishing, and my cousin was visiting family. I had come home late from work and was just chilling with a glass of wine in front of the TV. I can't remember what's going on. I usually just needed to empty my head after work, so I was just sitting there in the dark with nothing but the lights from the TV, lost in my own thoughts after the long evening shift. That's when I thought I heard some sounds outside. Usually when I hear sounds like that, I brush it off. I live in an old house. Old houses do make sounds randomly, and it was absolutely pouring with rain outside. Only once had it gotten that it was actually someone out there, and at the time, it had been an Eastern European group of guys scouting our house, since some groups, like that, travel around to small places to do burglary and petty crimes. I had this in mind, but I had not been home at the point. Only my fiancé and cousin were, and they ran after them, and the men jumped into their car and were never seen again. I told myself the sound I had just heard was either the house or the rain, until I hear another sound again, more clearly this time, and this time it came from the deck, on the side of the house where I was sitting. I froze as I heard steps moving closer to the window where I sat. The first window this person would come to, moving from that side of the house, would be to my bedroom. He or she wouldn't see anything inside there. The curtains were drawn and the lights were off. The steps kept moving towards the door we had on that side of the house, and I knew once they got there, they would be able to stare directly at me through the door window. I quickly turned off the TV so the room got dark. By doing this, I would for sure be telling them that I was home, unless they came from the forest behind the house, which means they had to climb and crawl a lot, and they would have seen that the TV was on from the front. To give you an idea of how my floor plan is, my house is built so that from the front you see the kitchen through 2 windows, and the living room through 1. Moving around the house to the back, you have the window to the bathroom, bedroom, and the door to the living room. And on one side you have a couple of big windows into the living room, and on the opposite side the entrance to the hall. And all around the ground floor we have a deck. So I sat still, my heart beating fast. I could barely breathe while I heard the steps, now slower, coming closer to the door. The wood on the deck making sounds as the weight of the person pushed down on it. That's when I see a big shadow of a man outside the window, stopping and looking in. I stayed still in the chair. I was sitting, hoping it was dark enough that he couldn't see me. As he started moving again, I gasped for air. I could hear him walking into my outdoor furniture and stopping. He probably didn't see them in the dark. For a split second, I debated with myself if I should go and turn on the deck lights, but I didn't want to let him know that I had seen him, scared of what this person could do. I lived in a small town, in one of the most baby-proofed countries in the world. These things were not supposed to happen here. Well, at least, I had felt safe up until then. It could have been someone pranking me thinking they were hilarious, but I was not willing to take that chance. I grabbed my phone and ran as quickly as I could out the kitchen and hid under the open counter area. I knew he wouldn't be able to spot me there from any window if I sat still. I quickly started dialing my dad's number, figuring it was either him or my brother who could come and help me fast enough. We share police with a neighboring town, and they are usually stationed there, which means it would take them at least 35 minutes to get to me. Though it was late, my dad was quick to pick up, figuring I wouldn't call him that late if it wasn't important. I whispered quickly into the phone so fast and with such a low voice that my dad couldn't hear me, and I had to repeat myself. "There's someone outside the house. He just looked through the window." As I said it a second time, I couldn't hold back my tears, and I began sobbing. My dad told me to stay put, and he would be on his way. He hung up, and I can remember how I had wished he wouldn't have done that. I would have felt safer had he stayed on the line, but I would soon find out why he did this. I tried to call my fiancé, and it went straight to voicemail. And again, straight to voicemail. I stared at my phone, hoping someone would call, trying to keep out the sounds of the footsteps that I could hear coming closer to the kitchen. Then absolute silence. I held my breath, listening. But I could only hear my own heartbeats. Had he jumped off the deck to the side where it was the closest to the ground? I waited before I crawled out and carefully peeked out one of the kitchen windows. I spotted him, walking slowly away from the house down my driveway. Then he stopped and turned around, looking towards the window where I was sitting. Was he smiling? I couldn't tell. It was so dark, and the street lights were not bright enough to illuminate him clearly. But I could have sworn he was smiling at me. At the same time, my driveway got lit up with lights from a car, and I could see who he was, before he ran into the neighbor's driveway and vanished behind some bushes. I jumped up when I realized whose car it was. It was my dad's business partner, John. I ran out towards him. My dad had called him and asked him to go to my house because he lived a lot closer. I had never been happier to see him. I quickly told him who I had seen, and he assured me that my dad was only minutes away before he jumped into his car to pursue the man. The man I had seen had been one of the brothers that we all found weird, the one known to be a schizophrenic drug addict. But why had he been outside my house? He wasn't known to burgle people's homes. My dad came and called the police, who took a statement. John came back and said that he had been unable to spot him, and that he had probably hid in the forest on the other side of my neighbor's house. The police couldn't arrest the guy since he hadn't done anything. Scaring the living hell out of someone was not a big enough crime, but they knew who he was and promised to talk to him and tell him to stop scaring people. As for me, they told me to call them if he ever did it again. I didn't stick around to see if he returned that night. I packed up some things and stayed over at my parents' house until my cousin came home 2 days later. It was in October of 2016. My then girlfriend broke up with me a week prior to this time. It did have an emotional impact on me, and I desperately needed something to lift me out of my mood. I was on Snapchat looking through the stories, and I see my then friend named Emilio had posted on his story, and it showed that he was outside the local Winn-Dixie in a car blasting rap music with somebody who I thought looked like a school shooter. Not long after the story, I get a phone call from Emilio. "Yo, you want to sneak out?" "I shouldn't. I'm working on my English 2 homework." Now, you see, Emilio isn't necessarily the kind of person who takes no for an answer. He may ask at least twice if you refuse. And after my excuses, he says, "Come on, you know you don't want to do your homework. Besides, you can come and smoke with us." When he said smoke, I automatically assumed he was talking about the green stuff. So I reluctantly agreed to meet him somewhere in my neighborhood. It was a pain to sneak out my house, since all the doors have squeaky hinges, let alone having a dog. I get my dog to sit outside the door that squeaks the least after I leave, which, thinking about it, made me feel like a total ass. I go to the parking lot of a local business and hide near the dumpster, call Emilio, and ask when they should be there. He says 5 minutes, and that they're going to show up in a white van. I chuckle, because there was no way in hell he was going to get in a white van. 5 minutes pass, and I see headlights approach, and take a guess what I see. A van. I felt all the color drain from my face, as I made the realization that the situation was bad. The van stops a few meters from me, and I force myself to approach it, since I had no other choice. I get inside, and it smells like what I can closely relate to toilet cleaner. The inside was disgusting, a blanket with various particles on it, and a very messy floor, as if someone lived in it. Emilio introduces his friend, Camden, and Lord Almighty, this guy looked like the type of person you'd find in a crack house. He had thin, wavy hair that went past his shoulders, green, buggy eyes, a moustache of a 7th grader who thinks he has facial hair, and a heavy build. I sit in the van as it drives out the neighborhood, projecting the best I could. After a few minutes, we drive to a place where people can fish. The guys had a box for an old iPhone, and inside that box were small crystals. It hit me right then and there that I snuck out to hang out with 2 meth heads. Right away, I told them I didn't want to smoke, and Amelia was fine with it, but I couldn't speak for Camden. I brought my cigarettes and lighter that night, and Emilio ends up using all my lighter fluid, which really annoyed me. But I held a poker face about it. In the background, while I watched him light a bowl of meth, a song named Chasing Dragons was playing. To this day, that song haunts me. Camden asks me if I can drive, as he was hinting that we rob a store up ahead. Emilio was against it, and Camden was like, I'm joking. In retrospect, I seriously hope he was. We ended up going to a Walmart. We were there for a while, and at some point I'm left alone with Camden. He begins babbling some stupid stuff, and again that's where my projection came into play. But the scariest part of that was when he was trying to get me interested in hanging out with him. Camden offered to drive me to school, and I agree. But in that instant I remembered that my mum agreed to take me to school that morning, so I let him know. Almost immediately after I said that, he got aggressive. "Really? Are you bullshitting me?" It sounded like he was threatening me. And when Emilio comes back out after a while, we leave. In the parking lot, we rendezvous in the van, and they have the bright idea of smoking more bowls. Camden hits the bowls, then he puts the pipe out like he was offering it to me. And right away I spit out, "I'm good." He replies, "Oh, good job." I made it abundantly clear to them that I'd never touch that stuff, thanks to some screwed up commercials I saw as a kid. But I feel like Camden didn't give a shit. Finally, time to go home. It was quite nerve-wracking, and he was speeding like a NASCAR driver. I was just praying he didn't get pulled over. We get at my house, and it's all over. I dropped him 2 weeks after this happening, but that wasn't the last time I saw him. One time when I was mowing my lawn at sundown, I saw the same van. I saw Emilio and Camden high off their asses smiling at me through the windshield, when I realized what just happened. I stopped what I was doing, ran back inside, grabbed my knife, and called my sister on her way home from work to be careful when she pulls in, because my paranoia told me they were going to come over. Thankfully, they didn't, and I hope to never meet them again. My friend June and I were 15 when we used to hang out all summer, riding her quad down to the river by ourselves. Her father didn't really care how long we were gone, so long as we were safe. But he worked nights as a prison guard in a different city, so he wouldn't really know if we were either way. Well, usually, things went fine. We stayed on the quad, messed around like teenagers do, got in the water, and went home. We almost always brought June's dog, Bo, and he was always useful to keep creeps away due to his size, as he was a bloodhound. However, one day we stayed later than usual, and it was getting pretty dark. We'd stayed late before, but we didn't like to do it often, so we packed up and left. When we got all the way home, put Bo in the house, locked up the quad, and realized that June didn't have her cell phone on her. Determined to not get in serious trouble with her dad in the morning when he found out she'd lost her phone, we decided to go back for it. Unfortunately, the quad was now low on gas, though we did have 2 spare bicycles. At first, we were only panicked because June's phone was missing. That was a pretty big deal by itself, but our unease grew as we rode past 2 vehicles that hadn't been on the path to the river before. The trucks were parked next to each other, and as we went by, the men exchanged some sort of goods. One of the men stuck something down his pants, and I was pretty sure I'd seen my first drug deal, and I'd always been taught I'd die for that. I didn't though, obviously. June waved at the men, which I remember cringing indirectly at. I don't know why I thought it was a bad idea, but I strongly believed that it would get us into trouble. We made our way to the area where we'd been sitting, searched for a few places we thought it could be, and eventually found the small silver device. It was on some rocks, and thankfully unharmed, though from its position, it must have fallen off the quad. We tried to go around where we knew the vehicles to be going through the bush, since we knew the area well, and we were both extremely uneasy. There was a rustle in the bushes to our right, and we both froze. My heart was pounding in my chest as I made almost direct eye contact with something. Its eyes were glowing. I let all my air out at once. It was just a deer. It ran towards us despite knowing what it was now, and we screamed a little. We gave up on going around. It was too dark, and the nature would always be one step ahead of us. This was in early high school, and we didn't have flashlights on our phones to see. To our dismay, on our way back to the original path, the vehicles were still there, or at least one of them was. And it still creeped me out to talk about the situation. I was sure something bad was going to happen to us. I remember seeing headlights pointing at us as we rode our bikes to the right as quickly as we could, but I was always the weaker of the two of us and was falling behind. June was yelling at me to hurry up, and I'm pretty sure I began crying at this point. I was so sure that if they got to one of us, it would be me. We got ahead of them enough to reach a slight curvature in the blackberry bush that separated this part of the path from the main one. June grabbed my hand to pull me down the bushes, and the thorns scraped against my exposed skin. I always wore shorts with my bikinis, but the rest of me was still open to the weapons of the bushes. It was worth it though, because they couldn't see us, and we could hear them. They idled in their car nearby, got out, and looked around a little. "Where'd they go? You see where they went?" "I thought they went that way." They got back in their car. Eventually, the headlights faded further, closer to the river, and further from our way home. So we bolted, grabbed our bikes, and pedaled as fast as our little legs could take us. We pedaled so hard and hoped that we wouldn't be followed home. We made it safely. We locked the gate to the yard and went inside and watched the road for a while. Nobody went by. We went to the river the next day and it was normal. There was something different though about the blackberries that we'd been hiding in. They'd been crushed, run over multiple times by cars until they were almost completely flat. I don't like to think about what would have happened if we'd have stayed in our oh-so-perfect hiding spot any longer. This was years ago, when I was 19 years old and working at a phone store. I was closing up for the night alone, when a man walked into the store before I could lock up. He then turned around, locked the door himself, and switched the sign to closed. I knew right then and there that I was being robbed. He looked at me with a hand in his jacket and says, "I want a phone, and I don't want to pay." I give this dude the biggest grin and say, "Whatever you want, boss," and I immediately walk to get him the newest iPhone, because he came off as an iPhone guy to me. Though I do remember being really annoyed that he dragged in a bunch of mud and water through the store. The dude was soaking wet because it was raining, and I was livid that I'd have to mop the floor again. You think of strange things in these situations. He then starts talking about how he has a gun, which was unneeded as I got the hint, and also begins talking about how he wants the phone hooked up with service. I found this to be an extremely odd request coming from the guy robbing me. I mean, you'd think he'd just tell me to give him all the money and phones in the store, but then I realized why he made this request. He starts screaming at the alarm on the wall, and I mean really screaming. I realize immediately this guy was on drugs, and I might die in this store tonight. I get this man an account, hook everything up, and I just wanted to give him what he wanted and get him out. As I'm doing this, he's walking around out of curiosity, grabs a ball, crumples a paper over it and unlocks the door, and buries it. He then comes back inside and says, "Don't worry, it'll grow into something much better." I could see all of it because the entire front of the store was glass. I just give him a weak chuckle and went with it. But then someone else pulls up into the store. It was my mum. She was picking me up because that very morning I had gotten into an accident and totaled my car. So she was going to drive me back to my place until I got a rental. After a little bit, she called the police because she knew something was wrong and correctly assumed I was being robbed. By the way, the whole process took forever. My life was on the line and I couldn't hook up the phone any faster than I'd like to. So, the guy is obviously complaining. Finally, I got his phone hooked up. He walked out the store and let his dog out the car and started driving crazy around the parking lot until the cops showed up. I bought a lottery ticket on that day, convinced that I used up all my bad luck for the year in a day. I still didn't win. I was catching a ride home from work one day at my last job, and the guy who was taking me home was always active and spoke about how he loved his daughter and blah blah blah. Anyway, we're in the car, and I'm gonna be honest, I liked to smoke weed. Occasionally I've done other things, but nothing I would consider hardcore. As I'm sitting in this man's car, he pulled out this glass pipe and asked if I wanted a hit. I know weed, and I know what weed pipes look like. I asked him what it was because I knew it wasn't weed, and he just said, "What do you think?" This is the point I'm uncomfortable, because at the time I was on probation for felonies, and I had a great first offenders program, which I was in, and didn't want to mess it up because, yeah, who wants 2 felonies? Back to the car ride. I guessed it was a crack pipe. I'd never seen one, and also never had seen this pipe. So, that was my educated guess. And that's when the guy goes, "Do I look like a crackhead?" This guy had prison tattoos, shaved head, and a ponytail, with which I had no response. And quickly, he gave me the reply, "This is meth." I quickly declined the generous offer, and thankfully I was very near my house because for the rest of the 2 minutes left on the ride was spent in very awkward and nervous silence. So today I write about you, my meth head friend, for you have showed me the difference of thy crack to thy meth head. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I hope that you did enjoy tonight's stories. If you did, be sure to show the love. Huge thank you to all my patrons who can be seen on screen. Your support is absolutely invaluable to me. If you would like to help keep the channel going, feel free to check out my Patreon. You can donate as little as $1 to receive a whole host of awesome perks and prizes. Like I said before, link in the description, and as always, very much appreciated. If you have a story to share that you would like narrated in an upcoming video, you can find the links in the description. But be sure to add plenty of description, punctuation, paragraphing, all the good stuff for me to select your story. Don't forget to also follow me on Twitter and Instagram, as I am trying to be more active on there. And my pop base is a pretty happening place, although I'll probably talk about that in more detail in a future video, because I put a lot of work into that and I think you guys will like it. But anyway, for now guys, I'm going to sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.